As the door creaked open, a chill ran through the room. John Anderson, battle-worn and weary, stood frozen in the doorway, staring at his loyal companion. Max, his German shepherd, stood motionless in the center of the room, eyes wide with fear, his once vibrant coat now dull and unkempt. Something was wrong. Max wasn't just tired. He wasn't just waiting for a treat or a scratch behind the ears. Max was standing still, as if caught in time, not even acknowledging the man who had been his constant companion for years. John's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen Max through the worst of it, through deployments, through dangers, through moments of joy and fear. But this was different. This was unsettling. John's mind raced. What could have happened? Why wasn't Max reacting? John took a cautious step forward, his boots muffling against the worn wooden floor. The familiar smell of home mixed with the musty air of an abandoned house. He reached out his hand, his voice barely a whisper. Max. Buddy. The dog didn't budge. A sense of dread gnawed at John. Something was terribly wrong. For a moment, he felt utterly helpless. He kneeled beside Max, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the dog's fur. No reaction. Nothing. He gently brushed his fingers over Max's coat, the coldness of the dog's body sending a shock through his system. The warmth he had always felt from Max, the warmth of life, was gone. Panic surged inside him. He called his vet, his voice cracking as he explained the situation. But the response was as cold as the room. I'm sorry, John. It doesn't sound good. Max might not make it. Those words hit John like a blow to the chest. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Max. He had saved him countless times, but now, Max needed him. And yet, there was nothing he could do. John's mind spun as he gazed at Max, his dog, his friend, the one who had been there through it all. His loyalty, his courage, his unwavering spirit. They had faced every challenge together. But this was different. This was something he hadn't prepared for. A quiet tear slipped down his face as he whispered, Please, Max. Not like this. He held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still time. Maybe a miracle could happen. Max, with all his strength, could come back to him. Then, just when John thought all was lost, he felt a slight movement. Max's tail twitched. It was so small, so faint, but it was enough. John's breath caught in his throat. Max. Max, are you with me? Slowly, Max's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, then the faintest wag of his tail. John let out a sigh of relief. It wasn't over. Not yet. Max wasn't ready to give up. Neither was John. John sat beside Max, the faint sound of the dogs breathing a fragile rhythm in the stillness of the room. The dim light from the afternoon sun filtered through the cracked blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. It was the quiet that unsettled him, the heavy silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. His hand rested on Max's head, gently stroking the dog's fur, and for a moment, it felt as though everything had come to a standstill. Time had stretched into an eternity since he had seen that flicker of life return to Max's eyes. The sound of Max's tail gently wagging, though small, had given John hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him from losing himself in the despair that threatened to overwhelm him. He had seen so much in his life, enough to know that moments like this, when hope seemed lost, were the ones that tested a man's strength the most. The room felt colder now, and John shivered slightly. He glanced at the clock. The hours were slipping by, each one bringing them closer to an uncertain future. The vet's words echoed in his mind. It doesn't look good, John. I'm sorry, but Max might not make it. The weight of those words hung over him, but he refused to let them define this moment. He wasn't going to give up on Max. Not now. He could see the faint rise and fall of Max's chest as he lay there, his eyes still closed. But the subtle movements gave John a sense of comfort. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. With a quiet sigh, John stood up and walked to the kitchen. His mind was racing, and as he fumbled with the cupboard, he grabbed the last bit of food that Max loved, a can of his favorite dog food. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the right thing to do. If Max was going to fight, then he would fight too. He didn't care what the vet had said. He wasn't going to give up on his dog. Returning to Max, John gently opened the can and placed it near the dog's nose. At first, there was no reaction. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation, the kind of silence that holds its breath. Then, just as John began to doubt, he saw it. Max's nose twitched. A soft inhale. Slowly, cautiously, Max began to lift his head. John's heart skipped a beat. "Max," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog's amber eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Max locked eyes with him. The connection was instant, as if the years of loyalty and companionship had not faded in the face of illness. Max's tail gave a hesitant wag, almost as if to say, "I'm still here." John knelt down beside him, his hand trembling as he stroked the dog's head. It was a simple touch, but in that moment, it was everything. "You're not alone, Max. I'm right here," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Max let out a soft whimper, his body still weak but the spark of life unmistakable in his eyes. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. It was just John and Max, bound together by the unspoken bond of love and trust. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now, there was hope. Max wasn't gone. Not yet. John sat quietly beside Max, watching as the dog slowly regained his strength. It had been hours since the brief moment of hope, and yet, Max had not fully recovered. The faint sound of the dog's breathing filled the room, a constant reminder that this fight was far from over. John didn't mind the silence. He had learned to appreciate moments like this, where the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something remarkable to happen. Max's tail twitched again, just enough to make John's heart flutter with hope. Slowly, the dog lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting John's with a flicker of recognition. For the first time since the morning, a soft bark escaped Max's lips, weak but determined. John smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. "That's it, boy. You've got this," he whispered, rubbing Max's head gently. The dog's eyes softened, as if hearing his voice was enough to reassure him that he wasn't alone. John had spent so much time in battlefields, facing enemies he couldn't see, but nothing had prepared him for the feeling of helplessness he felt watching Max fight for his life. The thought of losing him was unbearable. Max had been with him through everything, his constant companion in the most challenging of times. And now, as Max struggled to find his footing, John knew he had to be there for him. As the minutes passed, Max's breathing became more even, and his body began to relax. John stayed by his side, speaking to him softly, offering reassurance in the way only a true companion could. "You're a fighter, Max. You've always been a fighter." Max's ears perked up at the sound of John's voice, and he let out a soft whine, nudging John's hand with his nose. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Max was still there. He wasn't giving up. John leaned down, his forehead resting against Max's. He closed his eyes, letting the connection between them settle in. He had been through so much, lost so many friends in battle, but the bond he shared with Max was different. It was deeper, more steadfast. Max had saved him in ways no human could, and now it was his turn to save Max. The minutes turned to hours, and the sun began to dip below the horizon. The room grew darker, but John's resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't going to let Max slip away, not after everything they had been through together. "I'm here, Max," he said quietly. "We're in this together." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Max lifted his head again, his eyes clearer now, his body a little stronger. John could see the fight in his eyes, the determination to keep going. Max was not giving up, and neither was he. As the evening wore on, John continued to sit by Max, watching him with a mix of hope and caution. The light in the room had dimmed, but it was the light in Max's eyes that kept John from feeling the weight of the darkness around them. Max was still weak, but there was something undeniable in the way he responded now. He was coming back to life, piece by piece. John had been through so much in his life. He had seen death up close, lost friends in ways that still haunted him. But Max was different. Max had always been the one who understood him without words. The dog had been his rock, his protector, and now, as Max lay there, recovering, John felt a bond that had only deepened. "I knew you weren't giving up on me," John whispered, brushing his hand through Max's fur. Max's tail flickered again, barely moving, but it was enough. It was more than enough. The bond between them was tangible, almost like a promise being kept. Max had fought for him in ways that no human ever could, and now it was his turn to fight for Max. The night grew colder, and John wrapped his jacket around himself, trying to keep the chill at bay. Max, however, didn't seem to mind the cold anymore. His breath was steadier, his body no longer trembling. John watched, a slow smile creeping across his face as Max lifted his head, his eyes more alert now, more focused. It was a small victory, but to John, it felt like a monumental one. The fight was far from over, but the worst of it seemed to have passed. Max's eyes followed John's every movement now, and John could see the strength returning to the dog's frame. "We're going to make it through this," John said, more to himself than to Max. He stood up and stretched, feeling the tension in his muscles from hours of sitting still. Max shifted slightly, and John froze, not wanting to disturb the fragile moment. Max let out a soft grunt, lifting his head a little more. His tail flicked again, this time with more force. John's heart skipped a beat. "Good boy," he whispered, sitting back down beside him. The air in the room felt different now, lighter, charged with the hope that had been missing earlier. There was still a long road ahead, but as long as Max was with him, John knew they would face whatever came next together. Max was not just a dog. He was family, and family never gives up on each other. The days that followed were a mixture of quiet hope and cautious optimism. John stayed by Max's side, refusing to leave him alone for even a second. Each day, the dog grew stronger, his movements more fluid, his eyes brighter. It was as though Max was determined to prove that miracles were not just things of stories, but real, tangible moments that happened when you least expected them. John could see the strength returning to the dog's body, his legs no longer trembling as they had when he first opened his eyes. He was regaining his confidence, and so was John. The weight of uncertainty that had hung over them both was lifting slowly but surely. One morning, as John sat at the kitchen table, he heard a familiar sound, soft paws padding across the floor. He turned in his chair, his heart skipping a beat when he saw Max standing in the doorway. The dog's tail was wagging gently, his eyes fixed on John with that same unwavering trust. John's breath caught in his throat as Max took a tentative step forward, then another, until he was standing right beside him. "You're up, huh?" John asked, his voice thick with emotion. Max let out a soft whine, as though to answer. John reached down, ruffling the dog's fur, and Max nuzzled his hand, the warmth of his body a reminder of the bond they shared. It wasn't just the physical recovery that mattered, it was the emotional one. John had witnessed how Max's spirit had begun to heal, just as his own was. It wasn't just the survival of a dog that mattered. It was the survival of the connection they had fought for. "We're not done yet," John whispered to Max, his eyes filled with determination. "But you're getting better, aren't you?" Max looked up at him, his tail wagging even faster now. John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. This was more than just a battle for survival. This was a testament to loyalty, resilience, and love. As the days passed, Max became more like himself again, though still not at full strength. But the bond between them was undeniable. Max was not just his dog. He was his partner, his companion, and the one constant in a life that had been anything but predictable. John would stay by his side, just as Max had always been there for him. And together, they would face whatever came next, one step at a time. As the days turned into weeks, John and Max settled into a new rhythm. Max's recovery had been slow but steady, and every small improvement felt like a victory. John had learned to appreciate the quiet moments they shared, sitting together on the porch as the sun set, or walking down the quiet dirt road that led from his house. It wasn't the busy, chaotic life he had once known, but it was a life with Max, his loyal companion, the dog who had never once failed him. There was a comfort in their routine, a sense of peace that had eluded John for so long. One afternoon, as John sat on the porch, Max trotted up to him, his tail wagging with an energy that hadn't been there in weeks. John looked down at the dog, his heart swelling with pride. "Look at you," he murmured, reaching down to ruffle Max's fur. "You're getting back to your old self, huh?" Max gave a soft bark, his eyes bright with affection. It was a simple gesture, but to John, it was everything. It was proof that they had both made it through the hardest part. Life, for a while, had felt like a battle, one after another. But with Max by his side, John knew that he could face anything. The bond between them had only grown stronger through everything they had been through. Max was more than just a dog. He was family, and nothing would ever change that. As the days went on, Max's strength returned. He started running again, his steps lighter, his body more agile. It was as if he had never been sick at all, but John knew better. He knew the struggle, the fight Max had put up to stay by his side. And every time Max looked at him with those loyal eyes, John knew that they had both earned this moment of peace. They had both fought for it. The bond they shared was unbreakable, a testament to resilience and loyalty. John stood up from the porch and stretched, glancing at Max, who was now running circles in the yard. He chuckled softly, watching the dog's joy. "Good boy," John whispered, a tear slipping down his cheek. The world outside had never seemed so quiet, so calm. In that moment, John realized that it wasn't the battles or the victories that mattered the most. It was the quiet moments with Max, the ones where they were just two souls, side by side, finding their way through the world together. The days continued to pass, and with each one, John and Max settled deeper into the life they had built together. The mornings were quiet, filled with the sound of birds chirping and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. John would wake up early, the warmth of the sun already peeking through the blinds, and he would find Max waiting patiently at the foot of the bed, his amber eyes filled with the same unwavering loyalty that had never faltered. Every morning felt like a gift now, a blessing that neither of them took for granted. Max had become more than just a dog. He had become John's companion in the truest sense of the word. Their bond had grown stronger in ways that words couldn't fully express. It wasn't just about the days spent in silence or the walks through the quiet fields. It was about the trust they shared, the understanding between them that needed no words. Max had always been there for John, and now, in return, John was there for Max, every step of the way. One afternoon, as they walked along the familiar dirt road that led from their house, John couldn't help but smile. Max trotted beside him, his tail wagging in that familiar rhythm. The dog was healthy now, his body strong and his steps confident. It was hard to believe how far they had come from those first few days when John had feared he might lose Max. The road stretched out before them, winding through the trees and into the open fields beyond. John paused for a moment, looking around at the peaceful landscape, the wide open spaces that had once seemed so empty. Now, with Max by his side, everything felt different. Everything felt whole. Max sat down beside him, looking up with that same steady gaze that had always grounded him. "You're not just my dog, Max," John said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my family." Max let out a soft whine, leaning against John's leg in a gesture of affection. John reached down, scratching behind Max's ears, and the dog leaned into the touch, his eyes closing in contentment. In that moment, the weight of the world seemed to fade away. It was just John and Max, together, in the quiet of the afternoon, their bond stronger than ever. Life had a way of throwing challenges their way, but John knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, Max would always be there by his side. They had both fought too hard, too long, to let go now. And with that thought, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had made it through the hardest times, and they would face whatever came next together, as they always had. As the weeks passed, John and Max found a sense of normalcy, a peace that had eluded them both for so long. John had come to cherish the simple things, the morning walks, the sound of Max's paws on the gravel road, and the way the dog always seemed to know when John needed a little extra comfort. It was a bond forged in the toughest of times, and now, in this new chapter of their lives, it was stronger than ever. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the horizon, John sat on the porch, his legs stretched out in front of him. Max lay beside him, his head resting on John's knee, content and relaxed. The world around them was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of the leaves in the breeze. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" John whispered, his voice barely audible. Max's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and he lifted his head, his amber eyes looking up at John with unwavering loyalty. It was moments like these that reminded John of how much he had learned from Max, not just about loyalty and love, but about resilience, about pushing through the hardest of times and finding strength even when everything seemed hopeless. John reached down and gently scratched behind Max's ears, feeling the warmth of his dog's body against his hand. Max's tail thumped softly against the porch, and John smiled. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The bond between them was unspoken, yet it was everything. It was in the way Max always seemed to be there when John needed him most, and in the way John always knew how to comfort Max when he was hurting. They understood each other in a way that no one else could. As the days turned into months, John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had together. There were no grand gestures, no flashy moments. Just the quiet, everyday acts of love and companionship that made everything worthwhile. Max had given him so much more than just loyalty. He had given John a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. John stood up, stretching his legs and looking out at the vast open field in front of him. The world was still out there, full of uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Max stood up beside him, his tail wagging, and they walked together toward the horizon, side by side, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would always have each other. As the months continued to roll by, John and Max became more attuned to one another than ever before. Each day felt like a quiet victory. Max was no longer the frail dog who had fought for his life. His energy had returned, and his playful nature had resurfaced. It was as if the past struggles had only deepened the connection between them, making every small moment more meaningful. One evening, John sat on the porch again, watching the stars slowly appear in the sky as the last of the daylight faded. Max was lying at his feet, his head resting on John's boots, his body relaxed and at peace. The evening air was cool, carrying with it the sense of pine and fresh earth. It was the kind of night that felt timeless, as if nothing could ever disturb the tranquility they had found together. "We're lucky, you know," John murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Max lifted his head and looked up at him with those warm amber eyes, a silent acknowledgement that the bond they shared was all-encompassing. John smiled and reached down to gently stroke Max's fur. The dog responded with a soft nudge against his hand, the gentle pressure comforting, grounding him in a way only Max could. He realized in that moment how much they had both grown. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living, really living, with the fullness that only comes from understanding the fragility of life. Max had taught him that. He had reminded John of the simple joy that could be found in a wag of a tail, in a shared glance, in the quiet company of a friend who never judged. Max had been with him through the darkest times, and now they were walking side by side into brighter days. There were no promises about what the future held. Life was unpredictable, and there were still challenges to face. But with Max by his side, John knew he wasn't facing them alone. The world seemed vast, but as long as they had each other, it didn't feel so daunting. Together, they had weathered the storm. Together, they had found their way back to each other, stronger than before. As the first stars of the evening sparkled in the sky, John leaned back in his chair, allowing himself to fully absorb the peace of the moment. Max had his eyes on the horizon, ears alert, ever watchful, as if ready for whatever might come next. But for now, there was nothing but the comfort of the night, the companionship that filled the silence, and the quiet promise that no matter what the future brought, they would face it together. The seasons changed, and with them, the landscape around John and Max transformed. Winter's chill gave way to the warmth of spring, and the once barren trees began to bloom with new life. The days grew longer, and the nights became filled with the sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. John could feel the weight of the world lifting, just a little, each time he looked out at the vast sky that stretched above him. Max, ever faithful, stayed by his side, just as he always had. The dog had fully recovered now, stronger than ever, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, and his steps more confident with each passing day. John smiled to himself as he watched Max race across the yard, his tail high, ears perked, and eyes full of the joy that only a dog could truly understand. The bond they shared was unbreakable, forged in the fires of adversity and strengthened by every challenge they had faced together. "Look at you," John murmured, leaning against the porch railing as Max stopped in front of him, panting happily, his tongue hanging out in a satisfied grin. "You're something else, Max. You never gave up, did you?" Max sat down beside him, his head resting on John's leg, as if to say, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." John stroked Max's fur gently, his hand moving in soothing motions. It had been a long journey, one that had taken them through some of the darkest moments of their lives, But here they were, stronger and more connected than ever. Max had not only healed physically, but emotionally as well. The bond they shared now was deeper than it had ever been. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about finding joy in the simple moments and appreciating the beauty of life, no matter how unpredictable it could be. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, John felt ready to face it with Max by his side. There was nothing they couldn't handle, not as long as they had each other. Max let out a soft sigh and looked up at John, as if reading his thoughts. For a moment, they sat together in silence, the only sounds being the gentle rustling of the trees and the soft hum of life around them. John looked out across the field, taking in the view of the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. The world was vast, but it felt smaller now, more manageable, with Max by his side. They had weathered the storm, and now it was time to walk into the light, together. "We've made it, buddy," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Max's tail gave a slight wag in response, and they both sat there, watching the sunset, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side. As the seasons continued to change, so did the bond between John and Max. Their days had settled into a routine, one that was filled with quiet moments of companionship and simple pleasures. The days spent walking through the fields, the evenings watching the stars appear in the sky, and the early mornings spent sharing the calm of a world just waking up. It was a peace that John had longed for, a sense of normalcy he hadn't known in years. He looked down at Max, who was once again resting at his feet, his tail occasionally thumping softly against the floor. The dog's presence was a constant source of comfort, a reminder that, no matter what had come before, there was always a way forward. "You're something else, Max," John murmured, his voice filled with affection. Max lifted his head and gave him a soft look, his amber eyes still as full of trust as ever. John smiled and leaned down, stroking the dog's fur gently. Max let out a contented sigh, his body relaxing under the familiar touch. "We've both been through a lot, haven't we?" John said softly, his gaze drifting to the horizon outside. The world had felt heavy for so long, but now, with Max by his side, it felt lighter. There was a calm in their lives now, one that had been earned through perseverance and a shared understanding. They didn't need words to communicate. Their bond was stronger than that. Max had always been there for him, and John had always promised to do the same for the dog. And now, with every day that passed, that promise felt more meaningful than ever. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across the room, and John felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, truly living, and finding joy in the moments that mattered. He glanced down at Max again, his heart swelling with pride. The dog had fought so hard to stay by his side, and now, they were in this together, facing whatever came next as a team. The future was still uncertain, but John knew that with Max at his side, there was nothing they couldn't handle. "We've made it, buddy," John whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Max responded with a soft nudge, his eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. They had been through the darkest of times, but now, the light was beginning to break through. And for the first time in a long time, John felt truly at peace, knowing that whatever the world had in store, they would face it together. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, John and Max continued their quiet journey together, a journey defined not by the challenges they faced, but by the way they met each one head-on, side by side. The house they shared had become more than just a roof over their heads. It had become a sanctuary, a place where peace and healing could take root. Each morning, the two of them would step out into the world, the sun rising behind them, casting a golden glow over the fields that stretched for miles. Max would run ahead, his energy renewed, his spirit as bright as the new day. John would follow at a slower pace, but never far behind. The dog's playfulness never failed to make him smile. "You've still got that spark, don't you, buddy?" John would say, watching Max leap through the grass, his tail wagging with uncontainable joy. Max would look back at him with a soft bark, as if to say, "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." There was a time when John had feared that Max would never fully recover, that the bond they shared might be broken by the wounds of the past. But as the seasons shifted, so too did the healing that had taken place between them. What was once fragile had become unbreakable. Together, they had learned to navigate life's uncertainties, one day at a time. And with each passing day, they grew stronger, not just as companions, but as a family. John had lost much in his life, but he had gained something invaluable in Max, a dog whose loyalty could not be measured by any scale, whose heart was as steadfast as John's own. There were still challenges ahead. Life was unpredictable, and the world outside their quiet home was ever-changing. But in the presence of Max, John had come to understand something profound. No matter what the future held, it was the moments they shared, the love that flowed between them, that truly mattered. Max, in his simple yet profound way, had shown him that. "We've made it this far," John would say to him on quiet nights, as they sat on the porch together, watching the stars slowly fill the sky. Max would lean against his leg, content and secure in the knowledge that, whatever came next, they would face it together. And in that moment, under the vastness of the night sky, John knew with certainty that nothing could ever break the bond they had formed. Not time, not distance, not anything. They were, and would always be, together. The sun had begun to set once again, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, as John sat on the porch, his gaze lingering on the horizon. Max, ever faithful, was lying beside him, his head resting on John's lap. The soft breeze ruffled the fur along Max's back, and the comforting sound of the world settling into evening filled the air. For the first time in a long time, John felt a deep sense of contentment settle in his chest. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, the pain of the past had begun to fade, replaced by the peace that came from having Max by his side. It had been a long journey, one filled with moments of doubt and fear, but now, looking at the dog lying peacefully beside him, John knew they had made it. Max had been more than just a companion. He had been a lifeline, a constant presence through some of the darkest moments of John's life. Together, they had weathered storms, fought battles, and found solace in each other's company. And in the quiet of this moment, John realized that Max had given him something he hadn't known he needed, a sense of purpose, a reason to move forward. The weight of the world, which had once felt unbearable, now seemed lighter, shared between them. John's hand rested gently on Max's head, his fingers tracing the contours of the dog's ears. Max stirred slightly, looking up at him with those familiar amber eyes, full of trust and affection. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The world beyond their little home continued to turn, but in that space between them, everything felt just as it should be. "You're my best friend, Max," John whispered softly, as if the words had been waiting to be spoken for so long. Max let out a quiet sigh, his tail thumping once against the floor in acknowledgement. They didn't need words to understand each other. They never had. Their bond was something deeper, something unspoken. It was a connection that had been forged in the fire of adversity and tempered by the gentle rhythms of everyday life. And in that moment, John knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Side by side, they had already overcome so much. The bond between them was unbreakable, and as the last of the sunlight faded from the sky, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had made it through the hardest parts. Now, they had each other, and that was all that truly mattered.